Young woman searching for her missing father. A detective who's seen too much. A secret powerful enough to destroy the city's elite. But just when fear takes over, something unexpected happens. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The rain fell in silver sheets across Boston's cobblestone streets, turning the gas lamps into hazy golden orbs in the gathering dusk of October 1895. Miss Catherine Adelaide Winters stood beneath the awning of the old corner bookstore, her gloved hands clutching a leather satchel to her chest as though it contained her very soul. Perhaps in a way it did. Inside lay the last letter her father had written before his disappearance 3 weeks prior, a letter that made no sense yet filled her with a creeping dread she could not name. Catherine was 24 years old, with chestnut hair pinned elegantly beneath a navy blue hat adorned with a single feather, and eyes the color of stormy seas. Her beauty was the quiet kind, the sort that revealed itself slowly, in the graceful curve of her neck, the intelligence that sparkled in her gaze, the determined set of her delicate jaw. She had spent the past 3 weeks haunting police stations and hiring private investigators, all of whom had found nothing. Her father, Professor Henry Winters, a respected historian at Harvard University, had simply vanished from his study one evening, leaving behind only that cryptic letter and an overturned inkwell. The letter spoke of a discovery that would change everything, of a truth that had been buried for decades, of danger that lurked in unexpected places. It ended with a single urgent line: "Trust no one but yourself, my dearest Catherine, and if I do not return, seek Detective Alexander Hartford." Catherine had never heard the name before, but her inquiries had led her here, to a modest office above a tobacco shop on Washington Street. She had been standing in the rain for nearly 20 minutes, gathering her courage. What if this detective was just another dead end? What if he laughed at her concerns, as the police had done, suggesting her father had simply needed time away from his demanding academic life? Taking a deep breath that tasted of rain and coal smoke, Catherine crossed the street, her boots splashing through puddles that reflected the darkening sky. The door beside the tobacco shop was painted forest green, with brass numbers that read 221. She climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight, until she reached a frosted glass door etched with simple lettering: A. Hartford, Private Investigations. She knocked, 3 sharp raps that sounded far too loud in the quiet hallway. "Enter," came a deep voice from within, a voice that somehow managed to sound both weary and alert at once. Catherine pushed open the door and stepped into a world of organized chaos. The office was small but meticulously arranged, with bookshelves lining 2 walls, filled with volumes on criminal psychology, Boston history, and legal proceedings. A mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with case files, a brass magnifying glass, and a half-empty cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The scent of pipe tobacco lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the smell of old paper and leather. Behind the desk sat a man who made Catherine's breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. Detective Alexander Hartford was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead, as though he had been running his hands through it in frustration. His eyes were a striking shade of gray-green, intelligent and penetrating, the kind of eyes that seemed to see through pretense and straight into truth. He was tall. She could tell even though he was seated, with broad shoulders that filled out his vest and shirt sleeves in a way that spoke of physical strength, kept carefully controlled. There was a faint shadow of stubble along his strong jaw, and a small scar above his left eyebrow that only added to his rugged handsomeness. He stood as she entered, his movements fluid and graceful despite his size, and Catherine noticed the way his gaze took in everything about her in a single sweep, assessing, cataloging, understanding. It was not an invasive look, but rather the practiced observation of someone trained to notice details others might miss. "Miss Winters, I presume," he said, and there was no question in his tone. Of course he had been expecting her. Her father would have written to him, surely, before everything went wrong. "You know who I am," Catherine said, and it was not quite a question either. She moved further into the room, her wet skirts leaving a trail of water droplets on the worn wooden floor. "Your father wrote to me 4 weeks ago," Alexander Hartford replied, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit. You must be exhausted from your search." Catherine felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she had been carrying for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. Here, finally, was someone who did not dismiss her concerns. who acknowledged that her father's disappearance was real and worthy of investigation. She sat, placing her satchel on her lap, and found herself meeting those gray-green eyes directly. There was something in his gaze that steadied her, a quiet competence that promised he would not give up easily, that he would pursue truth wherever it led. "Then you know about his discovery," she said softly. "About whatever he found." Alexander Hartford settled back into his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin in a gesture that Catherine would come to recognize as indicative of deep thought. "I know that your father believed he had uncovered evidence of a significant historical fraud, something involving prominent Boston families and a land grant from the colonial period. He was careful not to reveal too much in his letter, but he was concerned enough to reach out to me. We had worked together before, you see, on a matter involving stolen documents from the university library." Catherine's heart began to beat faster. This was more than she had learned in 3 weeks of desperate searching. What kind of fraud? What families? "That," the detective said quietly, "is what we need to discover together. Your father's letter suggested that the truth was dangerous, that there were people who would go to great lengths to keep it buried. His disappearance would seem to confirm his fears." Catherine opened her satchel with trembling fingers and withdrew the letter, its edges worn from her constant reading and rereading. She handed it across the desk, watching as Alexander Hartford's eyes moved over the familiar words, his expression growing more serious with each line. "He speaks of you," she said, and heard the vulnerability in her own voice. "At the end, he tells me to trust you." Alexander looked up from the letter, and for a moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. Catherine felt it like a spark, a connection that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. This man, this detective she had just met, would help her find her father. She knew it with a certainty that defied logic. "Then I will do everything in my power to be worthy of that trust," he said, and Catherine believed him utterly. He stood, moving to one of the bookshelves and pulling down a leather-bound journal. "I've been conducting some preliminary research since receiving your father's initial letter. There are patterns here, Miss Winters, connections between certain families and unexplained acquisitions of property in the 1640s. Your father was following a trail that led back to the earliest days of Boston, to the founding families and the land they claimed." Catherine rose as well, drawn to the bookshelf to the detective's side. She was aware of how close they stood, could smell the faint scent of bay rum and something uniquely masculine about him. When he turned the pages of the journal, his hand brushed accidentally against hers, and the touch, even through her glove, sent an unexpected warmth through her. "I apologize," he murmured, but he did not step away, and neither did she. "What did he find?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was looking at the journal, but she was intensely aware of the man beside her, of the way the lamplight caught in his dark hair, of the serious set of his features as he focused on the problem before them. Evidence that one of Boston's most respected families, the Ashfords, may have built their fortune on a lie, Alexander said. A forged land grant, a falsified claim to property that rightfully belonged to others. It's a scandal that would shake the foundations of Boston society, that would call into question inheritances, titles, fortunes that have been established for 2.5 centuries. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. The Ashfords. Everyone in Boston knew the Ashfords. They were practically royalty, with connections to banks, shipping companies, the state legislature itself. If her father had threatened to expose them, if he had proof of their fraudulent origins, "They took him," she breathed, and suddenly the fear she had been holding at bay came rushing back, overwhelming in its intensity. "They took my father to silence him." She swayed slightly, and immediately Alexander's hand was on her elbow, steadying her, his touch firm and reassuring even through the layers of her sleeve. "We don't know that yet," he said, but his voice was gentle, not dismissive. "We will find the truth, Miss Winters. I give you my word." Catherine looked up into his face, so close now that she could see the darker flecks in his gray-green eyes, could see the concern etched in the lines around his mouth. She had never relied on anyone but herself and her father, had never allowed herself to trust in the strength of another. But standing here, with this detective's hand still supporting her, with his steady gaze holding hers, she felt something shift inside her, a cautious opening toward the possibility of partnership, of shared burden. "Catherine," she said impulsively. "Please, call me Catherine. If we are to work together, if you are to help me find my father, Then we should not stand on formality. A slow smile transformed Alexander Hartford's serious features, softening them, revealing warmth she had not expected. Then you must call me Alexander, he replied. And yes, we will work together. I suspect you would follow this investigation with or without my assistance, and I would rather we combine our efforts than work at cross purposes. Catherine felt an answering smile tug at her own lips, the first genuine smile she had managed in weeks. You are perceptive, Detective Hartford. Alexander. It's my profession, he said, and there was a hint of amusement in his tone now, a lightness that eased some of the heaviness in the room. Now let us begin. Tell me everything you remember from the days before your father disappeared. Every detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Sometimes the truth hides in the spaces between the obvious facts. They returned to their chairs, but the atmosphere had changed, had become charged with a sense of purpose, and underneath it, something else, something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. As the rain continued to fall outside and darkness settled fully over Boston, Catherine began to speak, and Alexander Hartford listened with the complete attention of a man who understood that he was being entrusted with something precious. The grandfather clock in Alexander Hartford's office marked 9:30 when Catherine finally finished recounting the last days before her father's disappearance. Her voice had grown hoarse from speaking, and Alexander had risen twice to refill her teacup, each time returning with that quiet attentiveness that she was beginning to recognize as fundamental to his character. The rain had not lessened, drumming steadily against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound that made the small office feel even more intimate, more removed from the dangerous world that lurked beyond its walls. Your father received a visitor the evening before he vanished, Alexander said, his fingers tracing patterns on the desk as he organized the information she had provided. A man you did not recognize, who spoke with him privately in his study for nearly an hour. You heard raised voices, but could not make out the words. Catherine nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm teacup. I should have insisted on knowing who it was, should have demanded answers. But father said it was university business, nothing for me to concern myself with. He seemed agitated after the man left, frightened even, though he tried to hide it from me. Can you describe this visitor? Catherine closed her eyes, trying to pull the memory into sharper focus. She had only glimpsed the man briefly as he was leaving, had seen him from the top of the stairs as her father showed him to the door. Tall, though not as tall as you. Perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and an expensive coat. He carried a walking stick with a silver handle. His bearing was that of someone accustomed to authority, to being obeyed. There was something cold about him, something that made me uncomfortable even from a distance. Alexander's expression had grown very still. A silver-handled walking stick. Did you notice anything distinctive about it? Any particular design? Catherine opened her eyes, surprised by the intensity in his voice. Yes, actually. There was something carved into the handle. An eagle, I think, or perhaps a falcon. Why? Do you know who he might be? Alexander rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked street below. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but Catherine could hear the underlying current of anger. That sounds very much like Nathaniel Ashford himself, the current patriarch of the family, a man with connections that reach into every corner of Boston's power structure. If he visited your father personally, then the threat is even greater than I feared. Catherine stood as well, driven by a sudden need to be closer to him, to not face this revelation alone. She crossed the room until she stood beside him at the window, and together they looked out at the dark city, at the scattered lights that fought against the encroaching night. What do we do? She asked quietly. If the Ashfords are behind my father's disappearance, how can we possibly fight them? They are untouchable. Alexander turned to face her, and in the dim light from the desk lamp his features were shadowed, serious, but also determined. No one is untouchable, Catherine. Everyone has secrets, vulnerabilities. The key is finding them. He paused, then continued more softly. But I will not lie to you. This will be dangerous. The Ashfords have maintained their position for generations through ruthlessness and the willingness to do whatever necessary to protect their interests. If they have your father, if they believe he poses a threat to them, then we must find him quickly, Catherine finished, her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her stomach. Before they decide he is too great a liability to keep alive. She saw something flicker in Alexander's eyes, something that might have been admiration mixed with concern. He reached out, hesitated for just a moment, then gently placed his hand over hers where it rested on the windowsill. The touch was warm, solid, anchoring her to this moment, to this partnership they were forging. "We will find him," he said, and the certainty in his voice gave her strength. "I have some contacts, people who owe me favors, who might know where the Ashfords would take someone they wished to keep hidden. There are properties, warehouses near the docks, old family estates outside the city. We will search them all if we must." Catherine turned her hand beneath his so that their palms touched, glove to skin, and she felt the calluses on his fingers, evidence of work that went beyond sitting in an office reviewing case files. "When do we begin?" "Tomorrow," Alexander replied. "First light. But tonight you should go home. Rest. You will need your strength for what lies ahead." "I cannot go home," Catherine said, and realized as she spoke the words how true they were. "That house is empty without my father. Every room reminds me of his absence. Every shadow makes me imagine threats that may or may not be real. I would rather—" She faltered, suddenly aware of the impropriety of what she was about to suggest. "Is there somewhere else I might stay? A hotel, perhaps?" Alexander's hand tightened slightly over hers. "The Ashfords will be watching your father's house, watching you. If they see you leave, see you checking into a hotel, they might move your father, might accelerate whatever plans they have for him." He seemed to struggle with something internally, then said carefully, "I have a spare room in my apartment, 2 floors above this office. It is modest, but clean and safe. You would be under my protection, and no one would think to look for you there." Catherine knew she should refuse, knew that staying in an unmarried man's apartment would be scandalous beyond measure if anyone discovered it. But she also knew that Alexander Hartford was offering her something more precious than propriety, safety, and the assurance that she would not face this night alone with her fears. "I accept," she said simply. "And thank you, Alexander, for everything, for believing me, for helping me, for—" She trailed off, not quite sure how to express the gratitude and the strange, growing trust she felt toward this man she had met only hours ago. "You need not thank me," he replied, his voice low and warm in the quiet office. "Your father helped me once, when I was investigating a difficult case, when doors were closing in my face and evidence was disappearing. He risked his professional reputation to give me access to university records that broke the case open. I owe him a debt I can never fully repay. But more than that," he paused, and Catherine saw something vulnerable flash across his features. "More than that, I cannot stand by when someone is in danger, when injustice is being done. It goes against everything I am." They stood there for a long moment, hands still touching, eyes locked, and Catherine felt her heartbeat quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. There was something happening between them, something she had never experienced before, a connection that seemed to deepen with every passing hour. It was dangerous, she knew, to feel this pull toward a man she barely knew, especially now, when her father's life hung in the balance. And yet she could not deny it, could not pretend that Alexander Hartford was simply a detective she had hired to solve a case. A church bell tolled in the distance, breaking the spell, and Alexander stepped back, releasing her hand with what seemed like reluctance. "Come," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Let me show you to the apartment. You should eat something and then try to sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." Catherine followed him out of the office, locking the door behind them with a key he provided, then up another flight of stairs to a solid oak door. Alexander's apartment was surprisingly homey, with warm rugs on the floors and comfortable furniture that spoke of a man who valued function and comfort over ostentation. There were more bookshelves here, filled with volumes on subjects ranging from philosophy to poetry, and Catherine felt a small smile touch her lips as she recognized several titles she loved herself. "The spare room is through here," Alexander said, leading her down a short hallway. He opened a door to reveal a cozy bedroom with a brass bed covered in a thick quilt, a small writing desk by the window, and a wardrobe that stood empty and waiting. "I apologize for the lack of proper ladies' accommodations. I don't often have overnight guests." "It's perfect," Catherine assured him, and meant it. The room felt safe, protected, and she could hear Alexander moving about in the apartment beyond, a comforting presence between her and whatever dangers lurked in the Boston night. Alexander hesitated in the doorway, and Catherine could see him wrestling with something. Finally, he said, "Catherine, I want you to understand something. What we are undertaking, this investigation, it could very well destroy the Ashford family. It could tear apart the fabric of Boston society. People we know, people we may care about, could be hurt by what we uncover. Are you certain you want to pursue this truth no matter where it leads?" Catherine met his gaze steadily, thinking of her father, of his integrity, of the way he had always taught her that truth was worth fighting for, even when that fight was difficult. "I am certain," she said. "Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, I must know what happened to my father. I must bring him home." Alexander nodded slowly, and she saw respect deepen in his eyes. "Then we are agreed. We see this through together to the very end." "Together," Catherine echoed, and the word felt like a promise, like the beginning of something that transcended this case, this moment. After Alexander had left her, after she had changed into a nightgown he had thoughtfully procured from a neighbor who asked no questions, Catherine lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the rain and the muffled sounds of the detective moving about his own preparations for sleep. She should have been exhausted, should have fallen immediately into oblivion, but instead her mind raced with possibilities and fears, with images of her father held somewhere dark and cold, with memories of the way Alexander's hand had felt over hers. Somewhere in the apartment, a floorboard creaked, and Catherine found herself comforted rather than frightened by the sound. Alexander Hartford was there, just beyond her door, a guardian against the darkness. She had spent 3 weeks fighting alone, carrying the weight of her father's disappearance on her own shoulders. Now, finally, she had an ally, someone strong and capable and determined to help her. But it was more than that, she admitted to herself in the privacy of her thoughts. Alexander Hartford had awakened something in her, some awareness of herself as a woman, not just a desperate daughter searching for her father. The way he looked at her with respect and intelligence and something warmer underneath made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. His presence, his proximity, made her acutely aware of her own heartbeat, of the way her breath quickened when he was near. It was foolish, she told herself firmly. This was not the time for such feelings, not when her father's life was in danger. And yet she could not quite suppress the small, secret hope that when this was over, when her father was safe and the truth had been revealed, perhaps there might be time to explore what was growing between herself and the detective with the gray-green eyes and the determined jaw. In his own room, Alexander Hartford stood by the window, looking out at the rain-washed city and thinking thoughts he knew he should not indulge. Catherine Winters was a client, a woman who had come to him for help, who trusted him to find her father and keep her safe. He had no right to feel this pull toward her, this desire to protect her that went far beyond professional duty. And yet, from the moment she had walked into his office, wet from the rain and determined despite her fear, something had shifted inside him. He had been alone for a long time, had dedicated himself to his work with a single-minded focus that left little room for personal attachments. His profession was not one that lent itself to domestic comfort, to the presence of a wife and family. He dealt with the darker corners of humanity, with crimes and secrets and lies, and he had always believed that dragging someone else into that world would be unfair, even cruel. But Catherine was different. She was not some fragile flower who needed shielding from harsh realities. She was intelligent, courageous, willing to face difficult truths in pursuit of justice. She would understand the demands of his work, would not ask him to be something he was not. And there was something about her, about the way she looked at him with those storm-gray eyes, that made him want to be better, to be worthy of the trust she had placed in him. Tomorrow, he reminded himself, they would begin the real search. He had contacts among the dock workers, men who noticed what came and went from the warehouses, who might have seen something unusual in recent weeks. He also had a source within the Ashford household itself, a maid who had once been grateful for his discretion in a delicate matter, who might be willing to share information about her employer's recent activities. It would be dangerous, bringing Catherine along on these inquiries, but he knew she would insist, and truthfully, he was glad of it. She deserved to be part of this search, deserved to play an active role in finding her father. He would simply have to be vigilant, have to protect her while respecting her agency and intelligence. The rain was beginning to ease, the storm passing over as storms always did, And Alexander found himself hoping that this too would pass, that they would find Professor Winters alive and well, that the truth would not be as dark as he feared. But he had been a detective too long to indulge in false optimism. The Ashfords were ruthless, and they would not have taken the professor without reason. Whatever Henry Winters had discovered, it was explosive enough to warrant extreme measures. Alexander turned from the window and prepared for bed, but sleep was long in coming. In the room down the hall, Catherine Winters lay awake as well, and he was intensely aware of her presence, of the trust she had placed in him, of the weight of responsibility that came with that trust. He would not fail her, he vowed to himself in the darkness. Whatever it took, whatever dangers they had to face, he would bring her father home, would see justice done, and perhaps, when all this was over, he would allow himself to explore these unexpected feelings, to see if Catherine felt even a fraction of what he was beginning to feel for her. But that was for later, for a future that could only exist if they survived the coming days. For now, there was only the case, the mystery, and the quiet knowledge that neither of them was alone anymore in facing what was to come. Dawn broke gray and uncertain over Boston, the rain having finally ceased during the small hours of the morning, leaving the city washed clean and glistening beneath a pale sun that struggled to assert itself through lingering clouds. Catherine woke to the smell of coffee and something baking, and for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar room, she could not remember where she was. Then memory returned in a rush. Her father's disappearance, the detective's office, the decision to stay here rather than return to that empty house that no longer felt like home. She dressed quickly in the same clothes from yesterday, wishing she had thought to bring a change of garments, then ventured out into the main living area of the apartment. Alexander stood in the small kitchen, his back to her, and Catherine allowed herself a moment to simply observe him. He had rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing strong forearms, and his dark hair was still slightly damp from washing. There was something appealing about seeing him like this, in this domestic setting, something that made her heart do a curious little flutter in her chest. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and the smile that lit his features when he saw her was genuine and warm, chasing away some of the shadows that seemed to perpetually inhabit his gray-green eyes. "Good morning, Catherine. I hope you managed some sleep. I've made coffee and there are fresh rolls from the bakery downstairs. Mrs. Chen is an early riser, fortunately for us." They sat together at a small table by the window, eating breakfast in companionable silence as the city came to life below them. Catherine found herself acutely aware of every small detail, the way Alexander's fingers wrapped around his coffee cup, the thoughtful expression that crossed his face as he reviewed something in his mind, the way morning light caught in his dark hair and softened the harder lines of his jaw. "I've been thinking about our approach," Alexander said finally, setting down his cup and leaning forward slightly. The Ashfords owned several properties that could be used to hold someone. A warehouse complex near the harbor, an old family estate in Brookline that has been largely unused for years, and a private sanitarium in Cambridge that they fund but keep very quiet about. "We should start with the warehouse. It's the most accessible, and if your father is being held there, time is of the essence." Catherine nodded, trying to ignore the fear that clenched in her stomach at the thought of what condition her father might be in after 3 weeks of captivity. "How do we get inside? Surely they will have guards? People watching for anyone who might come looking." "We will need to be clever," Alexander replied, and there was a hint of something almost mischievous in his expression now. "I have a contact, a man named James Murphy, who works as a stevedore on the docks. He owes me a favor, and more importantly, he has access to the warehouses for legitimate deliveries. If we can convince him to help us, we might be able to enter without raising immediate alarm." "And if we find my father?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If he is there, how do we get him out?" Alexander reached across the table and covered her hand with his, that gesture of comfort and solidarity that was becoming familiar between them. "One step at a time, Catherine. First, we confirm whether he is there. Then we assess the situation and formulate a plan. I will not act rashly and put either you or your father at greater risk." Catherine turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining naturally, as though they had been doing this for years rather than mere hours. "I trust you, Alexander. Whatever we must do, whatever risks we must take, I am ready." They finished breakfast quickly, Catherine, feeling the urgency of their mission settle over her like a familiar weight. Alexander provided her with a dark cloak to wear over her dress, something that would help her blend into the rougher neighborhoods near the docks. And together they descended to the street, where the morning was growing brighter, the last of the clouds beginning to break apart. The journey to the waterfront took them through changing neighborhoods, from the respectable business district where Alexander's office was located, through increasingly working-class areas where laundry hung between buildings and children played in the narrow streets, until finally they reached the docks themselves, where the smell of salt water and fish and tar filled the air. Great ships loomed at their moorings, their masts creating a forest of wood and rigging against the sky, and everywhere men shouted and labored, loading and unloading cargo with practiced efficiency. Alexander led Catherine to a weathered building that served as a workers' tavern, its interior dim and smelling of ale and tobacco smoke even this early in the day. Several men looked up as they entered, their expressions curious and somewhat suspicious, but Alexander moved with confidence to a corner table where a broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair sat nursing a mug of something dark. "Murphy," Alexander said by way of greeting, and the man looked up, his weathered face breaking into a grin that revealed several missing teeth. "Hartford, you old devil," Murphy replied, his voice carrying the lilt of Ireland. "I was wondering when you'd come calling on that favor I owe you, though I'll admit I didn't expect you to bring such charming company." He nodded respectfully to Catherine, his eyes shrewd and assessing. "This is Miss Winters," Alexander said, not elaborating further. "Her father has been taken by the Ashfords, and we have reason to believe he's being held in their warehouse complex. We need to get inside, James. We need to find him before it's too late." Murphy's expression sobered immediately. "The Ashfords, is it? That's dangerous business, my friend. Those are not people to cross lightly." But even as he spoke, Catherine could see him considering, weighing whatever debt he owed Alexander against the risk he was being asked to take. "I know what I'm asking," Alexander said quietly, "and I would not ask if there were any other way. But a man's life hangs in the balance, James. A good man, a man who does not deserve whatever fate the Ashfords have planned for him." Murphy looked at Catherine then, really looked at her, and she met his gaze steadily, letting him see her fear and her determination in equal measure. Something in her expression seemed to decide him, and he nodded slowly. "There's a delivery scheduled for this afternoon," he said. "Building supplies, lumber and the like, for some renovations they're supposedly doing. I can get you in with that shipment, hidden among the cargo. But once you're inside, you're on your own. I can't risk my neck further than that. Not with a wife and children depending on my wages. That's all we need," Alexander assured him. "Get us inside, and we'll handle the rest." The hours until the scheduled delivery passed with agonizing slowness. Alexander took Catherine to a small boarding house where his contact, the maid from the Ashford household, had agreed to meet them. The woman, whose name was Bridget O'Malley, was young and frightened, her hands twisting nervously in her apron as she spoke in hurried, hushed tones. "The master has been very agitated these past weeks," Bridget told them, her eyes darting nervously toward the door as though she feared being overheard even here. "He's been receiving visitors at odd hours, men I don't recognize, men who look like they're accustomed to doing things that decent folk don't speak of. And there have been trips to the warehouse, trips in the middle of the night when he thinks the household is asleep. But I see things, I hear things. The servants always do." "Has he mentioned Professor Winters?" Catherine asked urgently. "Has he said anything about a prisoner, about someone being held?" Bridget shook her head. "Not in so many words, miss. But I heard him arguing with his son, Master Philip, just 2 days ago. Master Philip was saying something about this having gone too far, about needing to end it before someone got hurt. And Master Nathaniel, he said—" She paused, swallowing hard. "He said it was too late for mercy, that they had come too far to turn back now, that the professor would have to be dealt with permanently." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face, and she swayed slightly in her chair. Immediately Alexander was there, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her, lending her his strength. "When?" he asked Bridget, his voice hard with urgency. "When were they planning this?" "Tonight," Bridget whispered. "Master Nathaniel said it had to be tonight, that they couldn't risk keeping the professor any longer. I don't know what they mean to do, but—" She trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air between them. They had no time to waste. Alexander pressed several bills into Bridget's hand, thanking her for her courage. Then he and Catherine hurried back to the docks, to where Murphy was waiting with a wagon loaded with lumber and covered with heavy canvas. They climbed in, squeezing into the narrow space between the wooden planks, and the canvas was pulled back over them, plunging them into stuffy darkness. The wagon lurched into motion, and Catherine found herself pressed close against Alexander, feeling the warmth of his body, hearing his steady breathing in the confined space. "We'll find him," Alexander murmured in her ear, his breath warm against her cheek. "I promise you, Catherine, we will not let them harm your father." Catherine wanted to believe him, wanted to let his certainty chase away her fears. Instead, she simply pressed closer, drawing comfort from his solid presence, and whispered, "I know. I trust you, Alexander. I trust you completely." The wagon rumbled through the streets for what felt like an eternity before finally rolling to a stop. They heard voices outside, gruff exchanges between Murphy and someone else, presumably a guard at the warehouse entrance. There was a tense moment when Catherine was certain they would be discovered, when she felt Alexander tense beside her, ready to fight if necessary. But then the voices faded, the wagon moved forward again, and they were through. When Murphy finally pulled back the canvas, they found themselves inside a cavernous warehouse, dim and filled with shadows despite the afternoon light that filtered through high, dirty windows. Crates and barrels were stacked everywhere, creating a maze of potential hiding places. Murphy helped them down from the wagon, his expression grim. "There's an office in the back corner," he said quietly. "That's where they'd likely keep anyone they didn't want found. But be careful, Hartford. I saw at least 3 men who looked like hired muscle when we came in. They're not regular warehouse workers." Alexander nodded his understanding, then turned to Catherine. "Stay close to me," he instructed. "If anything goes wrong, if I tell you to run, you run. Do you understand? You get out and you go straight to the police, to Captain Harrison at the central station. Tell him everything." "I will not leave you," Catherine said firmly. "Whatever happens, we face it together." She saw something flash in Alexander's eyes, something that might have been frustration mixed with admiration, and something deeper, something he was not yet ready to name. But there was no time for argument. They moved into the maze of crates, Alexander leading the way with the confidence of someone who knew how to move quietly, how to use shadows to their advantage. They had nearly reached the office Murphy had mentioned when Catherine heard it. A voice, weak and strained, but unmistakably familiar. "No, please, I've told you everything I know. There's nothing more I can give you." "Father," Catherine breathed, and before Alexander could stop her, she was moving, driven by 3 weeks of fear and desperation, running toward that beloved voice. The office door stood partially open, and through it Catherine could see her father, Professor Henry Winters, tied to a chair, his face bruised and his clothes torn. Standing over him were 2 large men, and seated behind a desk, watching the scene with cold calculation, was Nathaniel Ashford himself. Catherine burst through the door without thinking, without planning, driven only by the need to reach her father. "Get away from him!" she cried, and 4 heads turned toward her in shock. Alexander was right behind her, and Catherine saw him assess the situation in an instant, saw his hand move toward something concealed beneath his coat. But Nathaniel Ashford was faster, rising from his chair with surprising speed for a man of his age, a pistol appearing in his hand as though by magic. "Miss Winters," Ashford said, his voice cultured and cold. "How unfortunate that you've involved yourself in matters that do not concern you. And Detective Hartford, I should have known my old adversary would be part of this. You've always been too clever for your own good." "Let him go," Alexander said, his voice steady, despite the weapon pointed at them. "Whatever he's discovered, whatever threat you think he poses, killing him will only make things worse. People know about your fraud, Ashford. I've made certain of that. If anything happens to Professor Winters, if anything happens to any of us, the evidence will be delivered to every newspaper in Boston." It was a bluff, Catherine realized, a desperate gambit to buy them time. But Ashford seemed to consider it, his cold eyes moving between Alexander and Catherine, calculating odds and risks. "You're lying," Ashford said finally. "You've had no time to compile evidence, no time to secure it properly. This is simply you, detective, playing the hero for a pretty young woman." The tension in the warehouse office was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken threats and desperate calculations. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Nathaniel Ashford's finger rest against the trigger of his pistol, the weapon steady in his practiced hand. Her father slumped in the chair behind him, his eyes widening with horror as he recognized his daughter standing in the doorway, placing herself in mortal danger for his sake. "Catherine, no," Professor Winters managed through split lips, his voice cracking with emotion and exhaustion. "You should not have come. You should have stayed away, stayed safe." But Catherine could not regret her decision, could not wish herself anywhere but here, even with death staring her in the face. She had spent 3 weeks searching for her father, 3 weeks carrying the weight of not knowing, and now that she had found him, now that she could see him alive despite his injuries, she felt a fierce determination settle over her fear like armor. Alexander stepped subtly to the side, positioning himself partially between Catherine and Ashford's weapon, and she felt a surge of something warm and powerful at this protective instinct, at the way he was willing to shield her with his own body. His hand remained near his coat, and Catherine understood that he was armed as well, that he was waiting for an opportunity, a moment of distraction that might shift the balance in their favor. "You are wrong about the evidence, Ashford," Alexander said, his voice calm despite the circumstances, as though they were having a conversation over tea, rather than facing down a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to kidnap and torture. "Before I came here, I made certain arrangements. Documents are already in the possession of a trusted colleague, to be opened if I do not return within the hour. Your fraud will be exposed, your family's fortune revealed for the lie it has always been. The only question is whether you add murder to your list of crimes." Ashford's expression flickered, uncertainty crossing his features for the first time. Catherine saw it, that moment of doubt, and she seized upon it, stepping forward despite Alexander's subtle attempt to hold her back. "My father is a respected historian, a man known throughout academic circles," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "His disappearance has already raised questions. If he is found dead, if Detective Hartford and I are harmed, there will be investigations that even your considerable influence cannot suppress. You will have traded temporary security for certain destruction." "The girl speaks sense, Mr. Ashford," said a new voice from the doorway, and everyone turned to see Philip Ashford, Nathaniel's son, standing there with an expression that mixed guilt and determination. He was younger than his father, perhaps 35, with kinder eyes and a bearing that suggested he had not yet had his soul completely corrupted by the family's legacy of lies. "This has gone too far. I told you from the beginning that we should have faced the truth, should have acknowledged the fraud and worked to make amends. Instead, you have brought us to this, to the brink of becoming murderers as well as thieves. Philip, you do not understand what is at stake," Nathaniel Ashford snapped, but Catherine could hear the desperation creeping into his voice now. "Everything we are, everything this family has built for generations, all of it rests on maintaining the legitimacy of that original land grant. If the truth comes out, we lose not just our fortune, but our name, our standing, our very identity." "Then perhaps that is what we deserve," Philip replied quietly. He moved into the room, approaching his father with the careful steps of someone approaching a wounded, dangerous animal. "I have carried the weight of this secret since you told me of it 5 years ago, Father. I have watched it poison you, watched it turn you into someone I no longer recognize, a man who would order the kidnapping of a respected professor, who would contemplate murder to protect a lie. That is not who we are meant to be. That is not who I will allow us to become." Catherine watched this family drama unfold, saw the conflict in Nathaniel Ashford's face as he looked at his son, as decades of carefully maintained deception collided with paternal feeling. The pistol wavered slightly, lowering by a fraction of an inch, and in that moment Alexander moved. He was faster than Catherine would have believed possible for a man of his size, crossing the distance between himself and Ashford in 2 long strides, his hand closing over the older man's wrist and forcing the weapon upward and away. The pistol discharged with a deafening crack that echoed through the warehouse, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly in the wooden ceiling. The 2 hired men who had been guarding Professor Winters moved forward, but Philip Ashford stepped between them in the struggle, his voice ringing with unexpected authority. "Enough," Philip commanded. "I am still an Ashford, and I am ordering you to stand down. This ends now, here today. No more violence, no more lies." The men hesitated, looking between father and son, uncertain where their true loyalty should lie. In that moment of confusion, Alexander managed to wrench the pistol from Nathaniel Ashford's grip, stepping back and leveling it at the older man with practiced ease. Catherine ran to her father, her hands shaking as she worked at the ropes that bound him to the chair, her eyes filling with tears she had held back for so long. "Father, oh, Father, I was so frightened," she whispered, and felt his arms come around her as soon as the bonds fell away, holding her with desperate strength despite his injuries. "My brave girl," Professor Winters murmured into her hair. "My clever, courageous daughter. You should never have risked yourself for me, but I am so grateful you did. I have thought of nothing but you these past weeks, worried that they might come for you as well." Alexander kept the pistol trained on Nathaniel Ashford, who had collapsed back into his chair, all the fight seeming to drain out of him at once. He looked suddenly old, defeated, a man who had gambled everything on maintaining a lie and lost. Philip moved to stand beside his father, placing a hand on the older man's shoulder in a gesture that was both compassionate and resigned. "What happens now, Detective Hartford?" Philip asked quietly. "What punishment awaits my family for our crimes?" Alexander considered for a long moment, his gray-green eyes thoughtful as he weighed justice against mercy, consequences against the possibility of redemption. "That depends," he said finally, "on what you are willing to do to make amends. The fraud must be acknowledged publicly. The land and property that was obtained through the false grant must be returned or compensated for. And Professor Winters must be given full credit for his discovery, his reputation restored, and his safety guaranteed." "And if we agree to these terms," Philip asked, "then perhaps the law will be satisfied with restitution rather than imprisonment," Alexander replied. "Perhaps there is a path forward that does not require destroying lives unnecessarily, though your family's social standing will certainly suffer. That is the price of truth, Mr. Ashford. That is the cost of doing what is right after years of doing what is wrong." Nathaniel Ashford looked up at his son, and Catherine saw something break in the older man's expression, some final barrier of pride and stubbornness crumbling away. "You would do this, Philip?" he asked hoarsely. "You would see our family brought low, our name disgraced? I would see us act with honor for the first time in generations," Philip replied firmly. "I would see us face the consequences of our ancestors' actions and find a way to live with integrity going forward. That is worth any temporary disgrace, Father. That is worth more than all the false prestige our fortune has bought." The hired men, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quietly slipped from the office, wanting no part of what was to come. Alexander lowered the pistol slightly, though he did not put it away entirely, and gestured for Catherine and her father to move toward the door. "We are leaving," he said. "Professor Winters requires medical attention, and Miss Winters has endured enough trauma for one day. Philip Ashford, I will expect to hear from you within 24 hours regarding the terms we discussed. If I do not, I will have no choice but to bring formal charges and release all evidence to the press immediately." "You will hear from me," Philip promised. "You have my word as an Ashford, for whatever that is still worth." They left the warehouse, Catherine supporting her father on one side while Alexander walked on his other, alert for any final treachery. But none came. They emerged into the afternoon sunlight, into the noise and bustle of the docks, and Catherine felt as though she had been holding her breath for 3 weeks and could finally exhale. Murphy was waiting with his wagon, and he helped them load Professor Winters into the back, this time with cushions and blankets rather than hidden beneath canvas. "I heard the shot," Murphy said quietly to Alexander. "I was ready to come in after you." "Thank you, James," Alexander replied warmly. "Your debt is paid, with interest. I will not forget this." The journey back through the city passed in a blur for Catherine. She sat beside her father, holding his hand, unable to quite believe that this ordeal was truly over, that he was safe, that they had survived. Across from them, Alexander watched with those perceptive gray-green eyes, and every time Catherine looked up and met his gaze, she felt that connection between them strengthen, felt the awareness that they had been through something profound together, something that had forged a bond that would not easily be broken. They brought Professor Winters to Alexander's apartment rather than to his own home, unwilling to risk any final desperate move by the Ashfords before the agreement was formalized. Alexander sent for a discreet doctor who asked no uncomfortable questions, and while the physician tended to the professor's injuries, Catherine found herself alone with Alexander in the small sitting room, the adrenaline of the day's events finally beginning to fade, leaving her shaky and overwhelmed. "You were remarkable today," Alexander said softly, moving to sit beside her on the sofa. "The way you spoke to Ashford, the way you refused to be cowed by fear. Your father should be very proud of you, Catherine. I know that I am. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes again, but these were different from the tears she had shed in the warehouse. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something deeper and more complex that she was only beginning to understand. I could not have done any of it without you, she replied, turning to face him fully. You believed me when no one else would. You helped me when you had no obligation to do so. You risked your life for my father, for me. How can I ever thank you adequately for that? Alexander reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek, his touch infinitely tender. You need not thank me, Catherine. These past 2 days, working beside you, seeing your courage and intelligence, your fierce love for your father, it has been— He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. It has been extraordinary. You are extraordinary. Catherine felt her breath catch as she looked into his eyes and saw reflected there all the feelings she had been trying to deny, all the emotions she had told herself were inappropriate given the circumstances. But the circumstances had changed. Her father was safe. The mystery was solved. And here, in this moment, there was only herself and Alexander Hartford, two people who had been through fire together and emerged transformed. Alexander, she whispered, and it was both a question and an invitation. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, to retreat to safer, more proper distance. But Catherine did not retreat. Instead, she closed the remaining space between them, and when their lips met, it was like coming home, like finding something she had been searching for without even knowing she was looking. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question being asked and answered. But then Alexander's hand came up to cup her face, his fingers threading into her hair, and Catherine felt the restraint between them dissolve, felt 3 weeks of fear and tension and growing attraction finally find its release. She kissed him back with everything she had been holding inside, all the emotions she had been too afraid to acknowledge, and felt him respond with equal intensity, equal need. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Catherine saw in Alexander's eyes the same wonder she felt, the same sense that something fundamental had shifted between them, that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. I should not have done that, Alexander said, but he made no move to release her, his forehead resting against hers. You have been through so much, and I took advantage of your vulnerable state. I am sorry, Catherine. Do not apologize, Catherine replied firmly, her hands coming up to frame his face, to make him look at her directly. Do not ever apologize for this, Alexander Hartford. I wanted you to kiss me. I have wanted it since yesterday, since the moment you took my hand and promised to help me find my father. These feelings are not born of gratitude or relief. They are real, and they are mine, and I will not have you diminishing them. A slow smile spread across Alexander's features, transforming them, making him look younger, lighter, happier than she had yet seen him. Then I am the most fortunate man in Boston, he said, because I have felt the same, Catherine. From the moment you walked into my office, determined and frightened and so very brave, I knew that my life had changed, that I had met someone who would matter to me in ways I could not yet comprehend. They sat together on the sofa, Catherine nestled against Alexander's side, his arm around her shoulders, and watched the light fade from the windows as evening approached. In the next room, the doctor finished his work, reporting that Professor Winters would recover fully with rest and proper care. The older man insisted on seeing his daughter, and when Catherine entered his room, she found him looking battered but clear-eyed, watching her with knowing affection. He is a good man, your detective, Professor Winters said without preamble. I have known Alexander Hartford for several years, have watched him work with integrity and dedication. If there is something growing between you, Catherine, you have my blessing. I see the way he looks at you, and more importantly, I see the way you look at him. That is not something to be dismissed or denied. Catherine felt her cheeks warm, but she did not attempt to dissemble. It is too soon, perhaps, she admitted. We have known each other for only 2 days, and yet it feels as though we have known each other much longer, as though we have been waiting for each other without realizing it. The heart does not always follow logical timelines, her father said gently. Your mother and I knew within a week of meeting that we would marry. When you find someone who understands you, who sees your strength and values your mind as much as your beauty, you do not let that person go, simply because society says you should wait a more respectable interval. Over the following days, as Professor Winters recovered his strength and Philip Ashford made good on his promises, Catherine found herself spending more and more time in Alexander's company. They would take long walks through Boston Common, discussing everything from literature to philosophy to their dreams for the future. Alexander spoke of his work, of his desire to use his skills to help those who had no other advocate, and Catherine found herself imagining ways she might assist him, might become a true partner in his investigations, rather than simply a client whose case had concluded. The scandal, when it broke, was every bit as explosive as Alexander had predicted. The revelation that the Ashford fortune was built on fraud sent shockwaves through Boston society, toppling alliances and forcing a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about how many of the city's oldest families had established their wealth. But Philip Ashford handled it with remarkable grace, working with authorities to ensure that restitution was made, that wrongs were righted as much as possible after 2.5 centuries. Nathaniel Ashford, broken by the exposure of his crimes, retired from public life entirely, leaving his son to rebuild what remained of the family's reputation through honest dealing and genuine philanthropy. It would be a long road, Alexander told Catherine, but he believed Philip Ashford was sincere in his desire for redemption. Professor Winters published his findings in a lengthy paper that was acclaimed throughout the historical community, establishing his reputation as a scholar of uncommon integrity and courage. He returned to his teaching at Hartford with renewed energy, often speaking of how his ordeal had reminded him of what truly mattered in life: truth, honor, and the people we love. 3 months after that fateful day in the warehouse, on a crisp January afternoon with snow falling softly over Boston, Alexander Hartford called on Professor Winters in his study. Catherine, happening to pass by the door, heard her father's delighted laughter, heard him call out, "Catherine, my dear, would you join us for a moment?" She entered to find Alexander standing before her father's desk, looking nervous in a way she had never seen him before. In his hands, he held a small velvet box, and when he opened it, Catherine saw a ring nestled inside, a simple band of gold with a small diamond that caught the light and sparkled like captured starlight. "I know it has not been long," Alexander said, turning to face her, his gray-green eyes full of hope and love and just a trace of uncertainty. "I know that we should perhaps wait longer, be more cautious, follow the prescribed social timelines, but I find that I cannot wait, Catherine. I cannot imagine my life without you in it, cannot imagine a future where you are not by my side. You are my partner, my equal, my greatest discovery. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Catherine felt tears slide down her cheeks, but these were tears of pure joy, of a happiness so complete it seemed impossible that she had ever known fear or sorrow. She crossed the room to stand before Alexander, taking his hands in hers, feeling the strength and warmth of them, the promise they represented. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, Alexander Hartford, I will marry you. I will stand beside you through whatever cases you take, whatever challenges we face. I will love you with everything I am, for all the days we are given." Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he was kissing her, right there in her father's study, with the professor chuckling warmly in the background. When they finally broke apart, Catherine saw her future spread before her, bright and full of possibility. There would be more mysteries to solve, more truths to uncover, more dangers to face, but she would face them all with Alexander beside her, her partner in every sense of the word, her love and her equal. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Boston in white, covering old sins and making everything new again. And in the warm study, surrounded by books and history and the echoes of truth finally revealed, Catherine Winters held Alexander Hartford close and knew that she had found something more precious than any fortune, more valuable than any social standing. She had found someone who saw her completely, who valued her mind and her courage as much as her beauty, who would stand with her through darkness and light, through fear and triumph, through all the days of their lives. She had found her home, her partner, her love. And that, Catherine thought as she looked up into Alexander's eyes and saw her own joy reflected there, was the greatest truth of all, the kind of truth worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect, the kind of truth that once found changed everything forever. And so their story, which had begun with fear and mystery, with a desperate search through rain-soaked streets and dangerous confrontations, ended exactly as it should, with love triumphant, with truth revealed, with two souls finding each other against all odds and choosing to walk forward together into whatever adventures awaited them. The detective and the professor's daughter, partners in investigation and in life, ready to face whatever mysteries the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that, together, they could overcome any obstacle, solve any puzzle, and find their way through any darkness back to light.